In 1932, a Detroit housewife named Clara fed her family of 7 on $4 a week. Her secret was a single jar of bacon grease that touched every meal she cooked for 11 straight years. Today, the FDA would tell you that jar was a health hazard. But here's the strange part. Number 14 on this list was so effective that the government actively discouraged it during the war years because it threatened the rationing program. And number 3, scientists are now studying it for properties that modern preservatives cannot match. These 25 food hacks kept 25 million Americans alive through the worst economic collapse in our nation's history. Then, we forgot them on purpose. Because if you knew what your great-grandmother knew, half the products in your grocery cart would suddenly look ridiculous. Hit that subscribe button. What you are about to learn might change the way you cook for the rest of your life. Let us count down. Number 25. The bacon grease jar. Every Depression-era kitchen had one. A coffee tin or a glass mason jar sat right next to the stove, full of strained, golden brown bacon fat. Your great-grandmother would cook breakfast, then carefully pour the hot grease through a square of cheesecloth or an old flour sack rag, catching every drop in that jar. That was the cooking fat for the entire week. She fried potatoes in it. She made gravy with it. She greased her cornbread skillet with it. She even spread it on bread when butter was a fantasy, dusted it with salt, and called it a sandwich. A pound of bacon cost about 38 cents in 1933, and that single pound produced enough rendered fat to last 10 days of cooking. Modern food writers act horrified by this. But food chemists at the University of Wisconsin tested rendered bacon fat in 2018 and found it remarkably stable, lower in trans fats than most commercial vegetable oils, and rich in oleic acid. Your great-grandmother was throwing nothing away because she could not afford to. She just happened to be making her food taste better in the process. Number 24. Mock apple pie made from Ritz crackers. This sounds like a joke. It is not. When apples cost too much in the winter of 1934, and you still wanted pie for Sunday dinner, people reached for a sleeve of Ritz crackers. Ritz had launched that same year for 19 cents a box, and the recipe was printed on the back of the box for decades. The recipe called for 20 crushed Ritz crackers, 2 cups of water, 2 cups of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar, lemon juice, and cinnamon. The cream of tartar provided the tart bite of an apple. The crackers absorbed the syrup and broke down into something that genuinely resembled cooked apple slices in both texture and appearance. Baked between 2 pie crusts, the result fooled people. It still fools people. Blind taste tests run by food writers in the 1990s found that most testers could not tell the difference. The trick was the cream of tartar reacting with the sugar to create that specific apple pie tang that nothing else replicates. A whole pie cost about 11 cents to make in 1934. A real apple pie cost 3 times that. Number 23. Water pie. Here is a Depression dessert that sounds like it cannot possibly work. Pour 1½ cups of water into an unbaked pie shell. Sprinkle in 4 tablespoons of flour mixed with 3/4 of a cup of sugar. Add a teaspoon of vanilla. Dot the top with 5 tablespoons of butter cut into small pieces. Bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for the first 30 minutes, then 375 degrees Fahrenheit until set. What comes out is a pie with a sweet custard filling that tastes like vanilla pudding and creme brulee had a child. The flour thickens the water as it bakes, the butter melts down through the filling, and the sugar caramelizes lightly on top. Nobody knows for certain who invented water pie, but recipes for it appear in handwritten community cookbooks across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia from 1931 onward. It cost about 6 cents to make a whole pie. When the pantry was bare and the children needed something sweet at the end of supper, water pie was the answer. Most Americans today have never even heard of it. Number 22. Coffee stretched with chicory root. A pound of coffee cost 26 cents in 1932, which sounds cheap until you realize that 26 cents was almost half a day's wages for a working man during the depths of the Depression. So housewives stretched their coffee. The trick came up from New Orleans, where Creole cooks had been doing it for a century. You roasted chicory root, which grew wild in roadside ditches and cost nothing until it was dark and brittle. Then you ground it and mixed it half and half with real coffee grounds. The result was a brew that tasted darker, deeper, and almost more coffee-like than coffee itself. The chicory added body without bitterness, and 1 can of Folgers could be stretched into 2 weeks of mornings. Café du Monde in New Orleans still serves this exact blend today, and tourists pay premium prices for it. Your great-grandmother was paying nothing because she dug the chicory herself. Number 21. AG shells to clarify coffee. Even after the chicory trick, Depression-era coffee was rough. The grounds were cheap, the brewing was inconsistent, and the result often came out cloudy, with sediment floating across the surface. Your great-grandmother fixed this with 1 crushed eggshell dropped right into the percolator. The calcium carbonate in the shell pulled the bitter tannins and the loose grounds toward the bottom of the pot, leaving the coffee on top clear, smooth, and noticeably less acidic. This trick appears in cookbooks going back to the 1880s, but it became universal during the Depression because every kitchen had eggshells, and nobody could afford to throw out coffee that turned out wrong. A clean shell from breakfast, washed, crushed, dropped in the pot. The result rivaled what hotels served. Nobody does this anymore because we have paper filters. But the eggshell trick worked on a chemical level that filters do not, actually changing the taste of the coffee, not just removing particles. Number 20. Sour milk into buttermilk. Refrigeration in 1933 meant a wooden ice box with a block of ice the size of a brick that had to be replaced every 3 days. When the ice melted faster than expected, the milk soured. Modern Americans throw soured milk down the drain. Your great-grandmother turned it into the most prized baking ingredient in her kitchen. Sour milk was buttermilk by another name. The lactic acid in spoiled milk reacted with baking soda to create the lift that made Depression-era biscuits the lightest, fluffiest things on the table. Pancakes made with sour milk were tender and tangy in a way that fresh milk could never match. A quart of milk cost 10 cents in 1933, and not a drop went to waste. The minute it started to clabber at the edges, it went into a separate jar marked sour and sat there waiting for biscuit morning. Modern recipes call for buttermilk specifically because nothing else works the same way. Your great-grandmother had buttermilk for free 3 or 4 times a week just by paying attention to her milk. First, pattern. Break. Here is where Depression cooking gets interesting. Most of these hacks were not invented during the Depression. They were inherited. They came from immigrant grandmothers who had learned them in the old country during famines and wars going back centuries. The Depression did not teach Americans how to be poor. It reminded them. The Italian woman in Brooklyn who stretched her tomato sauce with breadcrumbs had learned that from her mother in Naples in 1898. The German farm wife in Iowa who turned cabbage into sauerkraut had learned that from her grandmother in Bavaria in 1875. When the bottom fell out of the American economy in October of 1929, those memories woke up. The skills had been hibernating. They came roaring back in time to feed a generation. And then we forgot them again the moment we got rich. That forgetting was the real loss. Number 19, Hoover stew. Named ironically after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the Depression, this was the meal of the Hoovervilles, the shanty towns where displaced families slept in tents and tar paper shacks. Hoover stew was whatever you had thrown into one pot. The classic version was hot dogs sliced into coins, canned tomatoes, macaroni, and any vegetables that were going soft in the bin. Onions, carrots, a wilted stalk of celery, a can of corn if you had it, a can of beans if the corn was already used. Everything simmered together for 30 minutes until the pasta cooked through and the broth thickened. A whole pot fed 6 people for under 30 cents. The hot dogs were the cheapest meat in America at the time, 4 cents apiece. The macaroni stretched everything. The tomatoes added the suggestion of a real Italian dish. Mothers served it with a slice of buttered bread, and children ate without asking questions. There are old photographs from 1934 showing entire neighborhoods sitting on porches, eating Hoover stew on summer evenings. It looked like dinner. It tasted like getting through. Number 18, onion sandwiches. This one will turn modern stomachs, but in 1933, an onion sandwich was a real lunch for millions of working Americans. It was a thick slice of raw white onion between 2 slices of buttered white bread, sometimes a sprinkle of salt, sometimes a smear of mustard. That was it. James Beard, the famous American chef, wrote about onion sandwiches with genuine reverence later in his career, calling them the most underrated lunch in American cuisine. The sweetness of a good Vidalia or Spanish onion against the richness of butter and the soft texture of fresh white bread created something far more interesting than the ingredients suggested. A pound of onions cost 3 cents in 1932. A loaf of bread was 8 cents. This was lunch for a week if you stretched it. Workers carried these sandwiches into the fields and the factories. The smell on their breath afterward was less important than the fact that they had eaten at all. Number 17, the poor man's meal. This was a Depression-era classic that fed children across the Midwest. 1 sliced potato, 1 sliced onion, 2 hot dogs cut into chunks, all fried together in a cast-iron skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease, salt and pepper. That was the entire recipe. The potato crisped at the edges, the onion turned sweet and translucent, and the hot dogs added smoky meatiness to everything. It cost about 14 cents to feed a family of 4 with this dish in 1934. Nothing fancy, nothing remarkable, just hot food on a cold night when the paycheck was gone and the next one was 3 days away. Mothers served it on whatever plates they had left after pawning the good china to pay the gas bill. Children remembered it for the rest of their lives. Number 16, stretching meat with oatmeal. When meatloaf became a cultural fixture during the Depression, it was not because Americans suddenly loved meatloaf. It was because mixing rolled oats into ground beef stretched 1 pound of meat into enough food for 6 people. The classic ratio was 1 cup of dry oats and 1/2 cup of milk per pound of beef. The oats absorbed the meat juices and the milk, swelling into something that mimicked the texture of meat itself. The result was a tender, moist loaf that sliced clean and tasted richer than plain ground beef. Nutritionists at the time, working with limited information, accidentally discovered that the combination of grain and meat created a more complete protein profile than either alone. Your great-grandmother knew nothing about amino acids. She just knew the family complained less about meatloaf than they did about bean soup. A pound of beef cost 22 cents in 1934. A box of oats cost 9 cents. The math made the meal. Number 15. Burnt sugar for caramel coloring, burnt sugar for gravy browning. When gravy looked too pale and the meat drippings were thin and grayish, your great-grandmother reached for white sugar. She would put 2 tablespoons of sugar into a small, dry skillet and heat it slowly until it melted, then darkened, then almost smoked. That deep mahogany syrup, a few drops at a time, transformed weak gravy into something that looked like it came from a Sunday roast at a fine restaurant. The trick was stopping just before the sugar burned bitter. The brown color and slight caramel flavor masked the fact that the meat itself had been a 12-cent piece of stew beef. Restaurants still use this technique today, calling it gravy browning, and they sell little bottles of it for $4. Your great-grandmother made it on the stove in 90 seconds, for free. Number 14. Stretching butter with gelatin. Here is the hack the government did not want spreading during the war years. Butter was rationed heavily during World War II, but the technique came from the Depression. Your great-grandmother could double her butter by whipping it with an equal volume of unflavored gelatin dissolved in warm milk, then chilling the mixture until it was solid. The result spread like butter, melted like butter on hot toast, and tasted almost identical to the real thing. 1 pound of butter became 2 pounds of spread for the cost of a 5-cent packet of Knox gelatin. Government nutritionists during rationing actively discouraged this practice because it allowed families to use less of their butter ration and to stockpile, which threw off the careful supply chain management of the War Food Administration. They wanted butter consumption to match the ration tables. The hack worked too well. By 1944, the government was running radio ads suggesting that stretched butter was inferior nutritionally, which was not actually true. Your great-grandmother made her butter ration last through the entire war. The government wished she had not figured out how. Number 13. Reusing pickle brine. A jar of pickles cost about 15 cents in 1933, and when the pickles were gone, the brine in the jar was still loaded with vinegar, salt, sugar, and dill. Your great-grandmother would slice cucumbers, onions, or carrots from the garden, drop them into that jar, and put it back in the icebox. 3 days later, free pickles. The brine could be reused 2 or 3 times before it lost its bite. Some families kept a permanent pickle jar going for months, refreshing it with new vegetables and a splash of fresh vinegar every few weeks. This practice has come back into fashion among gourmet cooks who call it quick pickling and pay premium prices for fancy pickling spices. Your great-grandmother was just refusing to pour anything down the drain that still had work left in it. Number 12. Bread heels into breadcrumbs. Nothing in a Depression kitchen got thrown away, and the rock-hard ends of stale bread loaves were no exception. Your great-grandmother dried them out completely on top of the warm stove or in a low oven, then crumbled them in a paper bag with a rolling pin. Those breadcrumbs went into meatloaf, into stuffing, into the breading for whatever cheap fish the family ate on Friday. They thickened soups when flour was running low. They topped casseroles to give the suggestion of crust. A loaf of bread that would have cost 8 cents was used down to the last molecule. Modern Americans throw out the equivalent of 40 pounds of bread per person per year. Your great-grandmother threw out none. Second pattern break. Here is the part that gets uncomfortable. The food industry watched what happened during the Depression and learned something important. Americans had figured out how to feed themselves on almost nothing. Once the economy recovered in the 1940s and 1950s, food companies spent enormous sums on advertising designed specifically to make these hacks feel old-fashioned, embarrassing, and unsanitary. Crisco ran ads showing modern housewives in clean kitchens with bright white shortening, contrasting them with grimy depictions of women using yellowed bacon grease. Folgers launched campaigns suggesting that real coffee did not need to be stretched. Wonder Bread implied that day-old loaves were somehow dangerous. The hacks did not stop working. They just stopped being acceptable. By 1965, the average American kitchen no longer had a bacon grease jar, no longer made buttermilk from sour milk, no longer used eggshells in coffee. We had been advertised out of our own grandmother's wisdom. The food companies got rich. We got worse food. Number 11, vinegar pie. Lemons cost 6 cents apiece in rural Tennessee in 1933, and shipping them out to Appalachian farms during the winter was financially impossible. So when your great-grandmother wanted lemon pie and there were no lemons, she made vinegar pie. The recipe used apple cider vinegar, sugar, eggs, flour, and a pinch of nutmeg or vanilla. Baked in a flaky lard crust, the result was tangy, sweet, and remarkably similar to a chess pie or a lemon meringue. The vinegar provided the acidity that lemon would have, and the long, slow baking mellowed the harsh edge into something almost custardy. Vinegar is doing the work here. Vinegar pie appears in community cookbooks across the rural South from 1929 to 1942, then almost vanishes. By 1945, lemons were back in stores everywhere, and the substitution was no longer needed. The pie was forgotten, but the technique still works perfectly, and the flavor is genuinely distinct. It is not a poor cousin to lemon pie. It is its own thing. Number 10, Eleanor Roosevelt's prune pudding. This dish became famous because Eleanor Roosevelt actually served it at White House dinners during the Depression to demonstrate that the first family was eating modestly along with the rest of the country. Critics called it bland and joyless. Defenders called it appropriate for the times. The recipe was prunes, flour, sugar, salt, and water simmered together until the prunes broke down into a thick, dark pudding. Some versions added cinnamon, some added a splash of vinegar to brighten it. The result was a dessert that cost about 4 cents per serving and provided iron, fiber, and natural sweetness without sugar rationing. Reporters in 1933 wrote scathing reviews of dinners at the Roosevelt White House, calling them culinary disasters. But Eleanor stood firm. She believed that if working families were eating prune pudding, the President of the United States could eat it too. The dish became symbolic of an entire era. Today, almost no one has heard of it. Number 9, wilted lettuce with hot bacon dressing. When the kitchen garden was producing leaf lettuce faster than the family could eat it, and the heads were starting to bolt or wilt, your great-grandmother turned them into a hot salad. She fried 2 or 3 slices of bacon, removed them, and added a 1/4 cup of apple cider vinegar and a tablespoon of sugar to the hot grease. The mixture would bubble and spit. She poured it directly over the bowl of torn lettuce. The greens collapsed instantly under the heat, absorbing the salty, smoky, sweet, sour dressing in a single rush. Crumbled bacon went on top, sometimes a hard-boiled egg, sliced thin. The whole salad cost about 7 cents and took 6 minutes. It tasted like something that should have come from a restaurant. Today, hot bacon dressing on wilted spinach appears on bistro menus in Manhattan for $14. Your great-grandmother served it on a Tuesday in 1934 for a fraction of that, on the porch, before she went out to weed the garden again. Number 8, cornmeal mush, sliced and fried. A pot of cornmeal mush cooked on Sunday evening was the foundation of 3 meals that week. The mush was poured into a loaf pan, allowed to cool overnight, and unmolded the next day. Sliced into half-inch slabs, it was fried in bacon grease until golden and crisp on both sides. The exterior crackled, the interior stayed soft and creamy. Topped with molasses for breakfast, it was sweet and filling. Topped with gravy for supper, it was savory and substantial. Topped with maple syrup, if the family had any, it became something almost luxurious. A pound of cornmeal cost 5 cents in 1933 and made enough mush for 15 meals. The genius of the technique was that one cooking session produced a versatile ingredient that could appear in completely different forms throughout the week. Modern Italian polenta is the same thing, dressed up in nicer clothes. Your great-grandmother knew it as breakfast. Number 7. Tomato gravy over biscuits. When the bacon was gone and the meat drippings were thin, your great-grandmother could still make a hot, satisfying breakfast gravy from a single can of tomatoes. She melted bacon grease in a skillet, stirred in flour to make a roux, then added a can of crushed tomatoes and a cup of water. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar balanced the acid. The result was a rust-colored gravy that thickened to a spoon-coating consistency. Poured over hot biscuits split in half, it became one of the most beloved breakfasts of the Depression-era South. The tomatoes provided vitamin C in a season when fresh vegetables were unavailable. The biscuits provided the bulk. The whole breakfast cost about 8 cents to feed a family of 5. Tomato gravy still appears on a few diner menus in Mississippi and Alabama, but most Americans have never tasted it. Number 6. The peanut butter and bacon grease sandwich. This sounds wrong on every level. It was not. During the Depression, peanut butter was one of the cheapest sources of protein available at about 14 cents a pound for the basic version sold in metal pails. Bacon grease was already in the jar by the stove. Your great-grandmother would spread peanut butter on one slice of bread and a thin layer of cooled bacon grease on the other, sometimes with a pinch of salt and pepper. Pressed together, it was a sandwich that delivered fat, protein, and satisfaction in a way that few combinations could match for the price. The smoky saltiness of the bacon grease cut through the heaviness of the peanut butter, and the result was something genuinely delicious. Variations included adding sliced onion or a swipe of mustard. Eleanor Roosevelt reportedly served peanut butter sandwiches at White House luncheons during the worst years of the Depression. The bun grease version was a working-class refinement that never made it onto an official menu. Third pattern, break. Here is what nobody tells you about Depression cooking. It was not joyless. The narrative we have inherited paints these years as gray, hungry, and desperate, with families chewing on whatever they could find. But the oral histories tell a different story. Children who grew up during the Depression remember meals with surprising warmth. They remember the smell of mush frying in the morning. They remember their mother's vinegar pie cooling on the windowsill. They remember the way the kitchen smelled when bean soup had been on the stove all afternoon. The food was simple, but it was made with care, and it was eaten together at a table by a family that knew exactly what it had cost to put it there. The poverty was real. So was the dignity. We have lost both the hardship and the meaning that came with it. We eat alone now, in cars, over screens, food that someone else made for us. We never had to think about it. Our great-grandmothers thought about every single bite. Number 5. Potato water for bread. When your great-grandmother boiled potatoes for supper, she did not pour the cooking water down the drain. She saved it, cooled it, and used it the next morning to make bread. The starches that had leached out of the potatoes during boiling created a more tender, longer-lasting loaf with a soft crumb that freshwater bread could not match. The natural sugars in the potato water also fed the yeast better, producing a faster rise. Bakers in Vermont and New Hampshire still use this technique for their highest quality sandwich bread and charge premium prices. Your great-grandmother did it because pouring out potato water seemed wasteful, and she had bread to bake the next morning. A loaf of homemade bread cost about 4 cents to make in 1934, compared to 9 cents for store-bought. The savings added up across a year. The flavor was better too. Number 4. The triple stretch. Your great-grandmother, who had truly mastered the art of making coffee last, would do all 3 things at once: half chicory and half coffee for the grounds, an eggshell in the percolator to clarify, and one more secret. After the morning brew, she saved the used grounds, dried them on a piece of newspaper next to the stove, and rebrewed them once with fresh water and a fresh eggshell for the afternoon. The second brew was weaker, yes, but for an afternoon coffee with a slice of bread and butter, it was perfect. 1 pound of coffee in 1933 stretched to 4 weeks of mornings and afternoons in a household where this was practiced. The same pound today, in the average American home, lasts about 10 days. We are not drinking more coffee. We are wasting more. Number 3. Onion poultice and onion broth as medicine. Here is the hack scientists are now studying. When children got sick during the Depression, doctors cost money the family did not have. So your great-grandmother made onion broth. A whole sliced onion simmered in water with salt and a little garlic for 30 minutes, then strained and given hot to the sick child by the cup. Researchers at Wageningen University in 2019 confirmed that onions contain compounds called quercetin and allyl sulfides that have measurable antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. The hot liquid soothed sore throats. The aroma cleared sinuses. The vitamins helped the immune system. Onion poultices, sliced onions wrapped in cloth and applied warm to the chest, were used for congestion and fever. These were not folk superstitions. They were genuine therapeutic interventions that worked because the chemistry was real. Modern medicine is now circling back to investigate exactly what your great-grandmother already knew. An onion cost 2 cents. A doctor's visit cost $2. The math made the choice. Number 2. The Friday night Spanish rice. When Catholics were not eating meat on Fridays and the family budget could not stretch to fish, your great-grandmother made Spanish rice. 1 cup of long-grain rice, 1 can of tomatoes, 1 diced onion, 1 diced green pepper, salt, pepper, and water. Everything went into a pot and simmered for 30 minutes until the rice was tender and had absorbed all the tomato flavor. A whole pot fed 6 people for less than 12 cents. The dish was filling, savory, and satisfying enough that nobody at the table missed the meat. Spanish rice traveled across the country during the 1930s along the migration routes of displaced families, picking up regional variations as it went. In Texas, it gained chili powder. In Louisiana, it gained cayenne. In Iowa, it stayed plain. The dish became one of the most common Friday dinners in working-class America for nearly 50 years. Then, frozen fish sticks took over in the 1970s, and Spanish rice quietly disappeared from the rotation. It was never replaced by anything as good for the price. Number 1. The bone broth jar. The single most important food hack of the Depression era was also the simplest. Your great-grandmother saved every single bone. Chicken bones from Sunday dinner, ham bones from holidays, beef bones from the rare Sunday roast, even the bones from the neighbor's chicken if she happened to be helping clean up. They all went into a pot of cold water with onion peels, carrot tops, celery leaves, and a bay leaf, and simmered for hours, sometimes a full day, on the back of the wood stove. The broth that resulted was rich, deeply flavored, and packed with collagen and minerals. It became the base for soup. It cooked rice and beans, it poached vegetables, it revived stale bread, it was given hot by the cup to anyone who was sick or tired or sad. The bones cost nothing, the vegetables cost nothing, the water cost nothing, and the result was the foundation of the entire week's cooking. Modern bone broth sells for $9 a quart at health food stores. Your great-grandmother made gallons of it for the price of the wood that fired her stove. Nutritionists now believe that the regular consumption of long-simmered bone broth was one of the reasons that Depression-era Americans, despite poor diets in many other ways, had remarkably strong bones, healthy gut function, and robust immune systems compared to modern Americans. The bone broth jar was the single most powerful food hack ever practiced in the American kitchen. We replaced it with bouillon cubes and lost something irreplaceable. Here's my challenge. Pick one of these this week. Just one. Save the bacon grease, make the vinegar pie, simmer the onion broth, fry the cornmeal mush. Then, come back and tell me if your great-grandmother was just being old-fashioned, or if she actually knew something that mattered. Because I tried the bone broth, and now there is a jar of it in my fridge every week. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the bacon grease jar gets more love than the water pie. These were not just food hacks, they were a way of life that fed a generation, and somebody made sure we forgot all about it.